All right, so what do we have here? Well, they do both involve the spinal cord and nervous system, but how are they similar? Well, they both have all these fibers running from here. So here we have the first step leading from the spinal cord. So now we're in the peripheral nervous system, and we have the first set of nerve fibers running from the central nervous system, but they end up at these little bulbs right here, these little swellings. And these, in the central nervous system, you call them a nuclei or ganglion. But a ganglion is a group of neuron cell bodies. So again, remember with the neuron anatomy, you have that thin axon, and that makes up the majority of the length of these nerve fibers. But the cell body, that's the plumper, more thicker area. So when you have a group of the cell bodies, you have a thicker swelling in this nerve. So in the central nervous system, you call a group of neuron cell bodies a nuclei typically, but sometimes ganglia, like the basal nuclei in the brain. Sometimes in older books, you often see it referred to as basal ganglia. So the correct term, if you want to be strict about it, is basal nuclei. But sometimes anatomists, especially historically, have switched between ganglia and nuclei into the central nervous system. Now, in the peripheral nervous system, it's pretty much always ganglia. When you have a group of neuron cell bodies, it's a ganglia. So what we have here, ganglion, 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 all these like little bumps. So again, what we have from these ganglia is a second set of neurons in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So we had our first set of neurons I highlighted in red and the second set. But so these are the similarities. You have pretty much two neurons running from the spinal cord to its target organ or tissue. And I'm going to show you more. So if you have a pen and paper, this might be a good time to get out the pen and paper. And it's also in the slides as well, but this is a simplified version of what I just showed you. So here we have a neuron. I'm just showing a very simple abstract diagram of a neuron. So again, here we have a cell body, here we have an axon, and here we have all the telodendria and the axon terminals. Then what we have is synapsing onto another neuron cell body or dendrites. And then what we have here is a bunch of cell bodies, and this is what we call a ganglion. Again, that's why those nerves running from the spinal cord have that little bump, because why you have all the neuron cell bodies from there. So the ganglion is actually a very important mark. Why? Because the neuron that leads to the ganglion, again, this is called a preganglionic because it's before the ganglion. So again, it's running from the spinal cord to a ganglion. Now the opposite of pre is post, right? So post means after. So now we have the neuron running after the ganglion. So it's called the postganglionic neuron. This is the same in both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. Now what we have here in the sympathetic, so you do have a preganglionic fiber, but it's relatively short, and then it synapses on all the cell bodies in a ganglion, and then you have a postganglionic neuron. Whereas in the parasympathetic, you still have a preganglionic neuron, but overall, parasympathetic preganglionic nerve fibers tend to be longer than sympathetic. So these tend to be longer, but they still lead to a ganglion. And then the ganglion has a postganglionic fiber. So again, these compared to the preganglionic, parasympathetic postganglionic fibers are relatively short compared to sympathetic. Again, you still have a set of preganglionic and both ganglionic or postganglionic. All right. So back to our sympathetic nervous system. So notice that all these ganglia are very close to the spinal cord. Why? Again, that preganglionic fibers are relatively short compared to the sympathetic or parasympathetic nervous system. All right, so if you are on campus, you probably are familiar with this place. This is one of the dorms on the UH Manoa campus. And I don't know if it's still going on. I mean, it was still going on when I was an undergrad. But and my students told me that like in all the previous years, what inevitably happens is like people are pulling the fire alarm at like 3 a.m. and causing everyone to get pissed off at them and whatnot. So all these fire alarms. So I like to think of it as this way. It's like E is for the E division is another nickname for the sympathetic nervous system. E can also mean emergency, right? So I'd like to think of it this way. Your brain is the fire alarm, and you have all these alarms down the column right here, right? So this is the way I like to think of the sympathetic nervous system. You have your brain, it's the fire alarm. You pull that fire alarm, sets off all these alarm bells down this tower right here. So I like to think of the sympathetic nervous system. You pull this alarm, and all these ganglia fire off like all these fire alarms on the multiple floors of the dorm. All right, so then sympathetic, parasympathetic control, how does that differ? Well, notice that the ganglia, they're not as close to the spinal cord. Now they're further away. So it's kind of like the parasympathetic is not, and remember, the preganglionic fibers are further and longer on average than the sympathetic ganglion fibers. So what we have here is like increased salivary and digestive gland secretion, increased digestive tract. So we have more of that saliva production to help you in digestion, and also more digestive activity as well. And also increased stimulation of urination and defecation. So this is an interesting thing. Compared to the sympathetic nervous system, where they're all kind of linked together in this emergency situation. So notice that these ganglia are all connected. So when you fire off that sympathetic nervous system, or when you have some sort of fire alarm, does the whole building evacuate, or only certain floors evacuate? So the whole building, typically all the fire alarms go off, right? So when you have a sympathetic response, this is going to trigger activity in all of these organs and downregulate the digestive and urinary and reproductive organs. But again, what happens? The heart pumps, the lungs you have increased respiration and breathing. So all of these occur at the same time. It's a coordinated response. But in the parasympathetic control, you have all these different functions. Now, when you're trying to eat your meal, are you thinking about urination and defecation while you're eating your meal? Are you going to the toilet at the same time as you're eating and drinking? Probably not, right? Or when you're trying to digest a meal, do you want this to be active as well? So the thing about parasympathetic control, instead of all of these happening at once that I listed here and on the previous slide, the parasympathetic nervous system can pick and choose what it wants to do at one time. Again, it's not an emergency. You don't need to do a coordinated response. So parasympathetic can choose which organs to actually activate. Well, actually, you can't choose. Your parasympathetic nervous system chooses for you. But again, not all of these are going to go off and show activity at once. Yeah, so imagine if you were eating and then crying, or eating and then this happened as well. So again, your parasympathetic nervous system, it's not like all of these ganglia fire off and all these nerves fire off at once.